Mary Hodges's fingers steadied as she refilled the water glasses, and she hoped her eyes wouldn't betray her. The crystal pitcher caught the lamplight, refracting amber across documents that could buy fortunes or purchase graves. Around the table sat men whose lawyers appeared in courtrooms but never made opening statements. Men who negotiated with handshakes that meant more than contracts. Men who spoke in figures that could fund cities or erase problems. She had learned during 2 years of exile that servers were ghosts. They existed to pour, to nod, to vanish. The moment she stepped from shadow into light was the moment she risked everything. So Mary moved through the sovereign room's private quarters like a phantom. Her footfalls absorbed by Persian rugs, her expression a practiced canvas of professional neutrality. She had mastered this erasure over 24 months of working at the exclusive establishment that served the kind of men who bought silence more readily than meals. Tonight carried a familiar poison, though. The atmosphere held a density that squeezed her ribs and made her pulse quicken. She recognized the sensation from her former existence, before the collapse. It was the same charge that permeated federal buildings before indictments dropped, before signatures destroyed lives. James Gillen occupied the table's power position, his authority radiating without performance. He was the species of man who never needed volume because silence already belonged to him. Dark hair swept back with precision, a face sculpted for corporate headshots or campaign posters, except for the ink. Those tattoos that crept past his collar told different stories, of territories claimed, of debts collected, of a world that operated beyond subpoenas. People spoke his name in whispers across the city's underbelly, but never carelessly. James Gillen represented the kind of influence that thrived in the margins between statute and street, the contested ground where empires rose and witnesses vanished. Across from him sat Anthony Marks, supposedly representing the Northside organization. Anthony was performing ease tonight, the kind of relaxation that comes with scripts already written. His suit carried the sheen of custom tailoring, his cufflinks probably worth more than Mary earned in 6 months. He gestured while speaking, animated and assured, like someone who already knew how the scene would end. Between them lay the contract. 47 pages of legal architecture dressed as a peace treaty. Mary had seen it when she'd brought the first course, had seen the embossed cover, the ceremonial fountain pen position just so, the theatrical presentation of reconciliation, territory agreements, profit-sharing arrangements, dispute resolution protocols. All of it window dressing for the trap hidden in Section 7. She shouldn't have looked. Shouldn't have let her eyes drift across the open pages while replacing the bread basket. Shouldn't have recognized the statutory language embedded like a landmine in subsection C. But 12 years of prosecuting RICO cases had trained her to see patterns, and 2 years of forced silence hadn't erased her instincts. The forfeiture clause sat there, elegant and lethal, disguised in the passive voice and cross-references that most attorneys would skim past. But Mary wasn't most attorneys. She had built cases on clauses exactly like this one. Had watched them turn criminal empires into federal assets with a single judge's signature. And she knew, with the cold certainty that had once made her the youngest lead prosecutor in her district, that the moment James Gillen signed that document, everything he'd built would become government property. Her hand trembled as she reached for his empty glass. She could stay silent. Should stay silent. Invisibility had kept her alive for 2 years. Speaking now, breaking her carefully constructed disappearance, meant exposure. Meant risk. Meant potentially dying in this room if Gillen decided she was part of whatever trap was being sprung. But she had stayed silent once before, when they demanded she participate in manufacturing evidence, when they'd threatened her career for refusing to falsify testimony. That silence had cost her everything, her career, her reputation, her identity. She couldn't watch it happen again. Not even to a man whose business card probably listed criminal enterprise under occupation. Anthony was mid-sentence, explaining some provision about revenue splits, when Mary heard her own voice cut through the room like a blade through silk. "That clause is a trap." The words hung in the air for a half-second that stretched into eternity. Then James Gillen's hand disappeared beneath his jacket, and Mary understood that the next 60 seconds would determine whether she walked out of the sovereign room or was carried out of it. Stay with me, because what this disgraced prosecutor does next turns the tables on the Mafia empire and the feds who destroyed her. If you're on edge right now, help me prove something wrong. My mother said stories like this wouldn't get me to a TWP 1,000 subscribers, but competence hidden in plain sight deserves to be told. Subscribe and let's expose more buried truths. 2 years earlier, Mary had stood in a different room where her words carried different weight. The conference room at the U.S. Attorney's Office had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the federal courthouse, a view she'd earned through 6 years of winning impossible cases. That morning, she'd walked in as the prosecutor who'd never lost a RICO trial. By noon, she would walk out as nothing. The file sat open on the mahogany table, and Thomas Carver's testimony transcripts stared back at her like an accusation. Carver was supposed to be her star witness, a mid-level accountant who'd kept books for 3 major crime families, who'd agreed to testify in exchange for witness protection. His testimony would dismantle organizations that had operated untouched for decades. It was the case that would define her career. Except Thomas Carver didn't exist. Not really. Mary had discovered it by accident, following a thread that shouldn't have been there, a tax return filed for a business that Carver claimed had closed 2 years before he started cooperating. She'd pulled deeper, expecting to find a mistake in the dates. Instead, she'd found a federal agent's personnel file buried in sealed documents. Thomas Carver was really Thomas Callahan, a 20-year veteran of an organized crime task force, playing the role of cooperating witness to manufacture evidence against defense attorneys who were getting too effective at dismantling federal cases. She'd taken the discovery to Raymond Voss, the assistant U.S. attorney who supervised her cases. She'd expected shock, maybe concern about the implications. Instead, Voss had closed the file with the careful precision of someone sealing a coffin. "This investigation is classified, Mary. Above your clearance level. You never saw this file, and you're going to prosecute this case exactly as planned." She'd refused. Told him she wouldn't manufacture evidence, wouldn't participate in entrapping attorneys who were simply doing their jobs. Told him she'd taken an oath to seek justice, not convictions. 3 days later, ethics complaints appeared. Allegations of improper contact with witnesses. Evidence tampering. Misuse of federal resources. All of it fabricated, all of it documented with the same meticulous care that she'd once used to build her cases. The disbarment hearing lasted 40 minutes. Her law license was revoked before sunset. The legal community moved on quickly, as it always did. Mary Hodges became a cautionary tale whispered in courthouse hallways, the promising prosecutor who'd cracked under pressure, who'd violated every ethical standard. Job applications went unanswered. Colleagues stopped returning calls. Her apartment lease wasn't renewed. She'd disappeared into the service industry because it was the only place where no one asked about her past. Where her hands could stay busy and her mind could stay quiet. Where she could be invisible and therefore safe. Until tonight, when staying invisible meant watching history repeat itself. The room emptied in 90 seconds. Anthony Marks tried to object, started to say something about maintaining momentum, but one look from Gillen silenced him. The associate who'd been taking notes gathered his materials with hands that shook slightly. The door closed with a sound like a vault ceiling. Mary stood perfectly still, the empty water pitcher still in her hand. Gillen hadn't moved except to remove his hand from beneath his jacket. Whatever he'd been reaching for remained concealed, but the threat hung in the air like smoke. "Put that down," he said quietly. "Not a request." She set the pitcher on the sideboard, her movements careful and deliberate. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but there was nowhere to go. 2 of Gillen's men stood outside the door. The private dining rooms at the Sovereign Room were designed for discretion, which meant they were soundproofed. No one would hear her scream. Gillen slid the contract across the table toward the chair Anthony had vacated. Sit. Mary sat. He studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes calculating in a way that reminded her of federal judges weighing testimony. Finally, he tapped the contract with one finger. The motion was almost gentle, which somehow made it more menacing. You have 10 minutes to explain exactly what you think you saw. If you're wasting my time, or if you're part of whatever game is being played here, my associates will ensure this conversation never happened. If you convince me you're worth listening to, we'll discuss what happens next. He leaned back, arms crossed, and waited. Mary's throat felt like sandpaper, but her mind shifted into the gear she thought she'd lost 2 years ago. She pulled the contract toward her, flipping to Section 7 with fingers that remembered how to navigate legal documents even if they'd spent 2 years carrying trays instead. Section 7, subsection C, she began, her voice steadier than she felt. It's written to look like a standard arbitration clause for dispute resolution. But the language here, any party may petition federal authorities for asset preservation pending resolution of claims, that's not arbitration language. That's forfeiture language. Gillen's expression didn't change, but he uncrossed his arms. She had his attention. It connects directly to 18 U.S.C. Section 1963, the federal statute for criminal forfeiture in RICO cases. The moment you sign this, you're agreeing that if any dispute arises under this contract, federal authorities can seize your assets, pending resolution. Except there is no resolution. Once they have your assets, they'll find a violation. They always do. She flipped to the signature page, pointing to the corporate entity listed as the other signatory. This shell company, North Point Holdings, I'd bet my life it's already cooperating with federal prosecutors. Your rival organization has been flipped. This isn't a peace treaty. It's a voluntary asset forfeiture agreement disguised as a business deal. Gillen picked up the contract, his eyes moving over the clause she'd identified. When he looked up, something in his expression had shifted. Not gratitude, men like him didn't do gratitude, but recognition. Who the hell are you? Mary's hands rested flat on the table, a prosecutor's posture she'd never quite lost. Someone who used to read contracts like this for a living. Gillen's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, then at her, then back at the screen. His expression remained neutral, but something shifted in the air between them. He typed something, waited, then set the phone down with deliberate care. I suspected there was something wrong with this deal, he said quietly. Anthony's been pushing too hard, moving too fast. In my line of work, urgency usually means someone's working against a deadline. I just couldn't see the angle. He paused, his gaze sharpening. But you saw it in what, 30 seconds? 2 years of carrying trays doesn't erase 12 years of prosecuting RICO cases. His phone buzzed again. This time when he looked at the screen, his eyebrows rose fractionally. He turned the phone toward her. The screen displayed her professional history, her record at the U.S. Attorney's Office, her conviction rate, the cases she'd built. And then the disbarment hearing, the ethics violations, the vanishing act that followed. Someone had compiled it fast, too fast for a simple background check. Gillen had resources that ran deeper than she'd imagined. Mary Hodges, he read from the screen. Youngest lead prosecutor in district history. Never lost a RICO trial. Disbarred for evidence tampering and witness interference. He looked up. Except the timing doesn't make sense. You got disbarred 3 days after requesting access to sealed personnel files. That's not how evidence tampering investigations work. That moment, past colliding with present, competence recognized by the enemy, it's pure fire. If it's got you hooked on her revenge arc, subscribe now. Because the conspiracy she unmasks next? It changes everything. Her throat tightened. No one had ever questioned the official story. No one had cared enough to look at the timeline. You found something they didn't want you to find, Gillen continued. And they buried you for it. He slid his phone aside. Here's what I know. Someone very sophisticated is trying to take my empire using federal law as a weapon. And someone equally sophisticated just identified their trap in under a minute. That's not coincidence. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to something almost conversational. I need to know everyone involved in this setup, who's been flipped, who's running the operation, and how deep it goes. You need to know why they destroyed your career 2 years ago. I'm betting we're looking for the same people. Mary's pulse hammered in her throat. This was the offer, not mercy, not gratitude, but transaction. Alliance with a man whose business was violence and intimidation. A partnership that would drag her deeper into the world she'd spent 2 years hiding from. But hiding had gotten her nowhere. And the alternative was watching Voss do to Gillen what he'd done to her. I'm in, she said. But I need access to everything, your communications with Anthony, the shell companies, any documentation of this deal. Gillen smiled for the first time that night. It wasn't a comforting expression. Done. Welcome to the family, counselor. Gillen's office existed in a space that shouldn't exist, 3 floors below a legitimate import company, accessible only through a freight elevator that required 2 separate key cards. The room had no windows, no decoration except a single abstract painting that Mary suspected concealed a safe. 3 computer monitors lined the desk, their screens dark until Gillen's fingerprint activated them. He'd left her alone 2 hours ago with a laptop, encrypted access to his communication records, and a warning delivered with casual menace. Everything you see here dies here. Understood. Mary understood. She also understood that the moment she ceased being useful, she'd disappear as thoroughly as her career had. She started with North Point Holdings, the shell company listed on the contract. Corporate records showed it was registered in Delaware 8 months ago, standard practice for entities that wanted privacy. But the registered agent was a law firm Mary recognized. They'd handled witness protection paperwork in 3 of her old cases. The connection made her stomach turn. Following the money revealed more shells, each one nested inside another like Russian dolls. But the pattern was familiar. Too familiar. She'd seen this exact structure before, in the case files she'd reviewed just before discovering Thomas Carver's real identity. The same careful layering, the same jurisdictional hopscotch designed to obscure ownership while maintaining federal access. She pulled up the contract again, studying the language with fresh eyes. The revenue-sharing provisions referenced specific accounting standards that only federal prosecutors would know to include. The dispute resolution mechanism used terminology from the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure. This wasn't a peace treaty between criminal organizations. This was a prosecution strategy disguised as a business deal. Her hands began to shake when she found the incorporation documents for the shell companies. The attorney of record was listed as Sarah Chen, a junior prosecutor who'd worked under Raymond Voss. The same Sarah Chen who'd signed the ethics complaint that destroyed Mary's career. The scope of it became clear with sickening precision. The Northside organization hadn't just been infiltrated, it had been systematically rebuilt as a federal asset. Every key position, every financial decision-maker, every voice that mattered had been replaced with agents or informants. Anthony Marks wasn't a representative of a rival organization. He was a federal operative delivering Gillen's empire on a silver platter. And the playbook was identical to the one they'd used on her. Create the appearance of legitimate business. Document everything. Then spring the trap when the target felt safe enough to sign. Mary pulled up the case law citations embedded in the contract's fine print. Her breath caught. United States versus Morrison, a precedent-setting forfeiture case. She'd prosecuted it 4 years ago. It was her work being weaponized, her legal strategies turned against someone else. The door opened. Gillen entered, carrying 2 cups of coffee that smelled expensive. He set one in front of her, studying her face. You found something. I found everything, Mary said, her voice hollow. And it's worse than we thought. Mary turned the laptop so Gillen could see the screen. 6 windows displayed overlapping networks of shell companies, court filings, and personnel records. At the center of every connection was a single name. Raymond Voss, she said. assistant U.S. attorney for the Eastern District. He ran the task force that destroyed my career. And he's running the operation against you. Gillen studied the screen for 30 seconds, his expression unreadable. Then he pulled out his phone and began typing. "What are you doing?" Mary asked. "Making a call. Voss has an office, a home address, a routine. Give me 48 hours and he's gone." "No." Mary's hand shot out, covering his phone. The gesture was suicidal, touching a man like Gillen without permission, but she didn't pull back. "That's exactly what he wants." Gillen's eyes went cold. "Explain." Quickly. "Voss has been orchestrating prosecutions for 15 years. You think you'd be the first person who wanted him dead? He has protocols, insurance policies, dead man switches. The moment something happens to him, sealed indictments get opened. Evidence gets released. Everyone he's ever built a case against gets rolled up simultaneously." She pulled up another file, this one showing a timeline of Voss's career. "Look at the pattern. Every 3 years, someone tries to come at him, through violence, through legal challenges, through exposure. And every time, they disappear. Not because he kills them. Because the system protects him. He's too valuable, too connected. Federal judges owe him convictions. Politicians owe him headlines. He's untouchable through force." Gillen set his phone down slowly. "Then how do we touch him?" Mary's fingers moved across the keyboard, pulling up statutes, case law, procedural rules. "The same way he touched me. With the law. He's been using prosecutorial immunity as a shield, hiding behind the idea that anything he does in pursuit of a case is protected. But immunity has limits. If we can prove he's manufacturing evidence, entrapping defendants, running operations outside his jurisdiction, we don't just expose him. We invalidate every case he's built. That takes time. Evidence. Documentation. Which is why you don't kill him. You let me build the case while your people gather the evidence. I need surveillance on Anthony Marks and every federal agent involved in this operation. I need communication records, meeting logs, financial transactions. Everything they're doing to trap you becomes evidence of their corruption." Gillen leaned back in his chair, calculating. "You're asking me to let them continue coming at me while you build a legal argument. I'm asking you to turn their trap into our weapon. Voss thinks he's untouchable because he controls the legal system. But I know that system better than he thinks I do. I built my career on finding weaknesses in seemingly perfect cases. This time, the case I'm building is against him." Gillen was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded once, sharp and decisive. "You get your time, counselor. But understand something, if your legal strategy fails, we do this my way." Mary met his eyes without flinching. "If my legal strategy fails, your way won't matter. We'll both be in federal custody." His smile was predatory. "Then I suggest you don't fail." Mary's hands steadied as she poured the wine, the crystal stem cool against her fingers. For days had passed since she'd warned Gillen about the contract, but to everyone at the Sovereign Room, she was still just the quiet waitress who never made mistakes and never asked questions. Tonight, Anthony Marks sat at table 7 with 3 of Gillen's mid-level operators. They were discussing territory disputes in the Marina District, their voices low and careful. To anyone listening, it sounded like business. But Mary heard something else in the rhythm of their conversation, the careful phrasing of people who knew they were building a record. She'd memorized the signs during her years prosecuting cases built on wiretaps and informant testimony. The unnecessary repetition of names and dates. The deliberate clarification of details that needed no clarifying. The pauses that felt just slightly too long, as if someone was taking notes. Anthony was wearing a wire. She'd bet her life on it. Mary refilled his water glass, her movements automatic, her face pleasantly blank. The tiny recording device would be somewhere on his torso, probably disguised as a button or integrated into his watch. She cataloged every detail, the way he positioned himself to keep all speakers within range, how he steered conversation towards specific topics, the phone he kept face down on the table that was likely transmitting audio in real time. "The waterfront properties transfer next week," said Marcus Chin, one of Gillen's logistics coordinators. "Unless there's complications." "No complications," Anthony assured him, his smile easy. "Everything's moving according to schedule." James has been very accommodating about the timeline. There it was, the verbal confirmation they needed. Anthony establishing Gillen's direct involvement, creating audio evidence that could be played for a jury. Mary's pulse hammered, but her hands remained steady as she cleared empty plates. One of the men at the table, David Restrepo, watched her for a moment too long. She felt his gaze tracking her movement, assessing. David had been with Gillen for 8 years, ran his real estate operations, and had a reputation for paranoia that had kept him alive. She met his eyes briefly, the way servers do when checking if anything else was needed, then looked away. Not too quickly. Not too slowly. Just another ghost performing her function. But David kept watching. Mary moved to the next table, her mind racing. Had he recognized something in her face when Anthony spoke? Had she hesitated, even fractionally, when the recording trap became obvious? Or was he simply being careful, the way survivors in Gillen's world learn to be? She cleared glassware from table 9, listening to Anthony's table through the ambient noise. They were wrapping up, preparing to leave. Anthony's hand moved to his jacket pocket, checking his phone, or maybe signaling his handlers that the recording session was complete. David leaned over and whispered something to Marcus. Both men looked toward Mary. Her throat tightened, but she maintained her performance. Invisible. Forgettable. Just furniture that happened to be ambulatory. When she finally retreated to the kitchen, her manager, Rick, barely glanced up from his clipboard. "Table 7 needs their check." Mary nodded, her professional mask perfect even as her pulse thundered in her ears. She'd gotten what Gillen needed: confirmation of the wire, identification of the trap, documentation of the players. But David Restrepo was still watching. And in this world, suspicion was contagious. One slip, and she was finished. Mary spent 3 days drafting the contract in Gillen's underground office, surviving on coffee and the kind of focused intensity she hadn't felt since her prosecutor days. The document grew to 63 pages, every clause a carefully constructed snare disguised as compromise. Gillen read it twice before speaking. "This looks like we're giving them everything they wanted." "That's exactly what it looks like," Mary said, pulling up a section on her laptop. "See Article 12? It's written as a revenue-sharing agreement that appears to legitimize their access to your operations. But the language here, any party acting in coordination with law enforcement, creates automatic liability. The moment they sign, anyone working with federal agents is documenting their own criminal conspiracy." She highlighted another section. "And this clause about verification of beneficial ownership, standard due diligence language. Except it requires them to disclose any government affiliation within their corporate structure. If they lie, it's fraud. If they tell the truth, they expose the operation. Either way, we win." Gillen leaned back, a slow smile spreading across his face. "You're using their own trap. Better. I'm making their trap illegal. The original contract would have given them your assets through forfeiture law. This version makes forfeiture impossible because it proves selective prosecution. They're targeting you while ignoring their own agents' criminal behavior, conspiracy, fraud, entrapment. Federal judges hate prosecutorial misconduct. One motion to dismiss based on this contract, and Vasa's entire case collapses." She pulled up case law on the second monitor. United States versus Santana. Prosecution dismissed when the government used informants to initiate the crime they then prosecuted. United States versus Williams. Evidence suppressed due to selective prosecution. I'm giving any defense attorney a roadmap to destroy Vasa's credibility. And the beauty is, they have to sign it to trap you, but signing it traps them. What if they don't sign? What if they see through it? Then we know they've been warned, which means someone leaked. Either way, we learn something. Mary closed the laptop. but they'll sign. Voss has been running this playbook for 15 years without anyone challenging him. He's arrogant. He thinks because it worked before, it'll work again. And Anthony's under pressure to close this deal before you get suspicious. Gillen picked up his phone. I'll arrange a meeting. Tell Anthony we've reviewed the terms and made revisions that address our concerns. Make it sound like we're trying to salvage the deal. How soon? Tomorrow night. Here at the Sovereign Room. Private dining room, same as before. His eyes met hers. This time, you won't be serving. Mary felt her pulse quicken. Tomorrow night, she'd face Raymond Voss's operation directly, not as a ghost, but as Gillen's legal counsel. The performance would be different, more dangerous. She'd have to sell the contract while knowing every word was designed to destroy the men across the table. They'll bring lawyers, she said. Good. Let them. Gillen's smile was predatory. I want witnesses when they sign their own confession. Mary nodded, understanding the stakes. Tomorrow night, they'd either dismantle Voss's entire operation, or they'd both be arrested by morning. There was no middle ground left. The federal agents arrived at 4:47 a.m., 12 vehicles strong, with battering rams and arrest warrants that named James Gillen and 17 of his associates. They hit 3 locations simultaneously: his waterfront office, his downtown residence, and the warehouse that supposedly housed his import operations. What they found instead was a corporate structure so clean it could have been featured in a business school textbook. Mary watched the raid unfold from Gillen's secure office, monitoring police scanners and federal communication channels that his technical people had quietly intercepted. Every search warrant authorization, every piece of probable cause, every informant statement that had justified this operation, she'd anticipated all of it. The agents tore through Gillen's waterfront office, searching for evidence of racketeering. They found meticulously documented import records, tax payments current to the day, and corporate filings that withstood scrutiny. The shell companies that should have hidden criminal proceeds instead revealed legitimate business transactions, each one structured by Mary to ensure legal compliance while maintaining operational flexibility. At his residence, agents expected to find evidence of violent enforcement. They discovered a home office filled with corporate governance documents, shareholder agreements, and compliance protocols that Mary had spent 3 months building. The warehouse held the real surprise. Instead of contraband or evidence of money laundering, federal agents found themselves facing a team of defense attorneys Mary had quietly retained. They'd been waiting in a conference room since midnight, briefed and ready with motions to suppress evidence based on prosecutorial misconduct. The lead attorney handed the supervising agent a 300-page filing. Mary had written most of it herself, a comprehensive motion to dismiss built on the contract Anthony Marks and his federal handlers had signed 6 months ago. Every clause they'd agreed to now served as evidence of entrapment, selective prosecution, and conspiracy between federal agents and supposed criminals. The motion included wiretap recordings of Anthony coordinating with Raymond Voss, financial records showing payments from federal accounts to supposed rival organization members, and communications that proved the Northside organization had been a federal operation from the beginning. By 7 a.m., the raid had stalled. By 9 a.m., federal prosecutors were in emergency meetings. By noon, Assistant U.S. Attorney Raymond Voss was suspended pending investigation. Mary's phone buzzed with a message from Gillen. Your way worked. The office is clear. Voss is finished. She responded with one word, good. But the real message came 3 hours later, when federal investigators announced they were opening an inquiry into Voss's task force. The same methods he'd used to destroy Mary's career were now being turned against him. The same colleagues who'd abandoned her were now distancing themselves from him. Mary closed her laptop and allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. She hadn't just survived Voss's trap, she'd dismantled the system that had protected him for 15 years. The raid that was supposed to destroy Gillen's empire had instead exposed the corruption at the heart of the prosecution. And Mary Hodges, the prosecutor they'd tried to erase, had orchestrated every move. Competence, it turned out, was the best revenge. 6 months later, Mary sat at table 12 in the Sovereign Room, the same private dining area where her life had changed. But tonight, she wasn't carrying a tray. She was Gillen's guest. The menu before her featured wine pairings more expensive than her monthly rent used to be. Across the table, Gillen discussed a real estate acquisition with the kind of casual confidence that came from having survived a federal prosecution attempt. His operations had evolved under Mary's guidance, still profitable, but now structured behind legal frameworks that made prosecution nearly impossible. She'd become his legal counsel officially 3 months ago, after the state bar quietly restored her license. The ethics violations that had destroyed her career were reconsidered once Voss's corruption became public knowledge. The manufactured evidence, the fabricated witness statements, the coordinated destruction of her reputation, all of it exposed during the federal investigation she'd triggered. Rick, her former manager, approached their table with practiced deference. He didn't recognize her at first. Why would he? Waitresses were furniture, easily forgotten. But when Gillen introduced her as his attorney, something shifted in Rick's expression: recognition, then discomfort, then the careful neutrality of someone realizing they'd underestimated a person they'd once supervised. "The 2015 Barolo, Miss Hodges?" he asked, his voice professionally pleasant. "That would be perfect," Mary said, meeting his eyes with calm certainty. She watched him pour, noting the slight tremor in his hands that hadn't been there when she'd worked for him. Rick had been kind enough, in his way, but he'd also taught her the most important survival skill: invisibility. He'd shown her how to move through rooms of powerful men without being seen. Now she understood that invisibility had been a chrysalis, not a cage. She'd learned to observe without being observed, to listen without being heard, to understand power structures from a position others dismissed. Those 2 years of exile had given her something her prosecutorial career never could: the ability to see the system from outside it. Raymond Voss was awaiting trial now, facing charges that mirrored the ones he'd fabricated against her. His task force had been disbanded. 3 federal judges were under investigation for accepting cases built on manufactured evidence. The legal community that had abandoned her was now reassessing every conviction Voss had secured. Mary's new office occupied space in one of Gillen's legitimate buildings downtown. Her door had her name on it, properly styled: Mary Hodges, J.D. She kept regular hours, took legitimate cases, and occasionally advised Gillen on matters that existed in the gray spaces between legal and illegal. She'd learned that the law wasn't the pure instrument of justice she'd once believed. It was a tool, and like any tool, its morality depended on who wielded it. If her rise from the ashes hit you, thank you. These tales of hidden power live because of you. Smash like, subscribe, hit the bell, and drop a heart in the comments if you believe real competence always wins. Let's toast to that. Gillen raised his glass. To competence. Mary smiled, lifting her own. To competence. She'd found her power not by escaping the system that broke her, but by becoming too competent to break again. And James Gillen, the man who'd reached for his gun when she first spoke, now trusted her with his empire. Because real power, Mary had learned, recognizes real competence, no matter where it comes from.